Lake. Now here at Michilimackinac, they had 11 pieces of artillery in the 1770s, and that included 2 of these light 6-pound field guns. They were typically stored, parked inside on the parade ground, and moved around as needed. Now, this weapon is capable of firing that 6-pound cannonball, which is about 3.5 inches in diameter, at maximum about a mile, so that'll get you out to the cable anchorage on the bridge, that large block, it will come down on this side. That's again the maximum range. More accurate or effective range is perhaps half of that. So you might imagine 2 circles drawn around the fort at those distances, and if the British didn't want you within those circles, they could use their artillery to try and convince you to leave. Now, a gun of this size in combat, at least on paper, should have a crew of about 14 fully trained members of the Royal Regiment of Artillery. So those would be soldiers wearing the uniform that Stephen has on. A little bit, again, more specifically trained than the regular infantry soldier, also a bit better paid. Now I mentioned there were 2 of these guns here in the 1770s, as well as 9 other pieces of artillery, and I think some of you walked around with Stephen taking a look at some of those artillery pieces. But here's a little bit of math for you. If they have that many artillery pieces and just one of these requires 14 artillerymen, how many artillery soldiers do you think were actually posted here at Michilimackinac at that time? Nobody has an answer? Nobody wants to do some quick multiplication? Have you got your phones out so I know you can do this math real quick? So a lot of people will say a lot, right? So there's at least 2 of these things. They should each have 14. So on paper you might have 28 right there. You know, it might end up being a couple hundred if everything works out the way that it should, again, on paper. Realistically, there's usually just 1 artillery soldier stationed here. So the fact that Stephen's the only one wearing this uniform right now is correct, because that's typically what you actually would have seen here in the 1770s. As a result, training with these weapons became key, because they would need to train other people to fill out some of the roles on the gun. We know that they were training members of the 8th Regiment, so the infantry soldiers that were stationed out here in the Great Lakes alongside them. At Niagara in New York, those infantry soldiers drilled so often with the members of the Royal Regiment of Artillery that officers said that they were essentially artillerymen in everything but name. But that takes practice. You have to drill regularly, and artillery soldiers would have to drill with these things as well. This mechanically is very, very simple. It's basically just a tube mounted on 2 wheels. To turn it into that powerful and effective weapon, you need to know how to actually use it. So practice would have been key. And so they would be drilling with these weapons quite regularly, and that's what we are going to show you right now, is a practice run. If we were in combat with that full 14-person crew, we could go much quicker. Maybe once every 15 seconds we'd be able to fire that 6-pound ball. You're not going to see us move that fast right now because, well, there's only 3 of us, and we do want to tell you about it. But we'll walk through that drill first by telling Luke and Stephen to prepare for action. So they're going to actually start taking bits off the cannon. This is a field gun, remember. It's designed to be mobile, it's designed to be towed around on the battlefield, and as a result, it does need to be, to some extent, self-sufficient. It needs to support itself. It carries its own ammunition. That's what is in these boxes. Realistically, that ammunition should be moved much further behind the firing line, perhaps back on the other side of the field there. There are some tools that are being removed that Stephen's going to use to clean and load it here in just a moment. Also some covers to keep water and debris out of the barrel. Once all that is done, I can tell them to man out the piece, so Stephen's going to step up front, Luke's going to remain at the rear. You can, again, do this with far fewer people. It just becomes a whole lot more efficient with that full crew. So we'll tell Luke to tend vent. He's going to cover up a touch hole on top of the barrel with his thumb, makes the whole cleaning process substantially more effective and quite a bit safer. I can now tell Stephen to search piece. He's going to take a big corkscrew and run that down the barrel, give it a spin, trying to remove any solid debris potentially left down the barrel from our last shot. really make sure there's nothing burning down there, I can now tell Stephen to advance sponge. He's going to pick up another tool, one end of which is wrapped in wool. He'll dip that in some water. That advanced sponge piece, he'll push that down the barrel. The wet wool on that swab, combined with some air pressure, maybe you heard that thump there, should extinguish anything that was left burning, and the gun should now be clean and safe to load. So I can now tell Stephen to advance cartridge. He's going to come back, take out our ammunition, return to the muzzle. So Stephen's now done 3 separate jobs. If we had a full crew, every one of those jobs would have an individual person assigned to it, including someone who is just running ammunition back and forth. So I can tell Stephen to load, he's going to place that into the muzzle, and then at the command ram down cartridge, he's going to pick up that swab. The other end of it has a solid rammer head, and at the command ram down cartridge, he'll push that down the barrel so it is seated under Luke's thumb. So the gun's loaded now. I can tell Luke to prime. He's going to take a brass priming wire, run that down the touch hole that tears a hole in that powder bag, and then that box that he's wearing around his waist contains pre-made fuses. He'll drop one of those down, and that's what you'll actually use to fire the gun in just a moment. So once that's done, it will have been clean, loaded, and primed. It is technically ready to fire at this point, but what do you need to do next if you actually want to hit something? Aim it. Yeah, aim. So next command be take aim. You can see that screw under the breech. That elevation screw very precisely changes the angle of the barrel. You can also use the spike here at the rear of the carriage to point it to the right or the left. And that truly is where the kind of more advanced technical skill of artillery soldiers comes into play. Again, they could make this an accurate weapon out at about half a mile, able to hit something, maybe the size of that blockhouse up there, which again is quite impressive considering that this is a smoothbore piece. So we are just about ready to fire. We want to warn you, it is a cannon. It'll be a little bit loud. One of the ways we know they were firing for practice here is that people wrote about hearing it while they were still miles away. They could hear the guns being exercised here. It's not going to be quite as loud. We're not firing quite as much powder, but I would still recommend you use your fingertips and put those in your ears. If everybody's ears are covered, the last 2 commands are make ready, fire. And there you have a cannon drill. Now our next activity is going to be at 3:30. That's going to be back inside the fort, and that'll be a tour of the gardens and some of the things you see growing. We'll see leave that at 3:30. So again, back inside in maybe 20 minutes. Otherwise, thank you all for visiting this afternoon.